Welcome. My name is Nicolas Lepine, and I am presenting on the effects of integrating the scientific method into physical education. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I'm the creator of Montessori Physical Education, which are lessons that integrate the classroom curriculum with physical education. My website is montessoriphysicaleducation.com. If you see this screen, you are at the right website. A little bit about me. I got my Montessori certifications AMS 6 through 12 about 10 years ago. And then I continued on with my master's in Montessori education at St. Kate's, with my master's thesis being about the integration of physical education with the classroom curriculum. And basically, I haven't looked back since. I never really intended to be a teacher, but it's basically in my DNA. Both my parents are teachers. I started as a classroom assistant for a couple years. I then did my certification work, and then while I was an intern, and then from there, I was a classroom teacher for 6 years. And even though I am currently the PE instructor and athletic director, I've been helping in the classroom, teaching lessons for many years now. When I was younger, I was always the kid who was never the best at any sport. I loved to play them all, but I was also never the worst. So, I thank my parents that they let me play lots of different sports. Um, and then when moving on to college, I was interested in the human body and exercise. I did the research route. I did personal training as well. Um, and then from there, once I started getting into teaching, that soon parlayed into turning into a PE instructor and athletic director, which I currently do right now. I've also been coaching basketball for over a decade, as well as every other sport here at Rogers Park Montessori School. Since you're at this presentation, I think it's safe to assume that you believe that physical education is necessary. The CDC has lots of data that shows that physical education boosts classroom performance, whether it's by getting the kids moving, more exercise. It teaches life skills as well. But what if it could do more? It's been my experience that most Montessori schools fall into one of two camps. That either the school has teachers that have to teach the PE curriculum, or they have a PE teacher if they're lucky enough, but that PE teacher doesn't have Montessori training or experience. Um, the nice thing about my curriculum is that it is designed for both people. That if you're a classroom teacher who does not feel comfortable teaching the physical education, you will see the classroom concepts in those PE lessons. And if you're a PE teacher that doesn't have Montessori experience, this will give you a scope and sequence of what types of lessons you can do that support the classroom. If you're wondering how to create this physical education integrated curriculum, first you need to align your PE curriculum with your classroom curriculum. You're literally going to follow the classroom curriculum. This gives you the scope and sequence that you need. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. From there, you need to create games that combine those concepts from the classroom with well-known games. And after you play them, almost just as important as playing the game itself, you need to discuss the different symbols, terminology, and concepts that were used in the game to help explain concepts that they're trying to learn in the classroom as well. When I did my master's thesis, it was about integrating physical education with the classroom curriculum, and I worked with a lower elementary class to look at the effects of that integration, and this is some of the research that I got initially. But there was a lot more that I knew I could do. The game that my lower elementary played was a solar system scavenger hunt, and that was helping them memorize the planets in their order. So you can see that this is a comparison of what they knew before playing the games and then what they were able to remember afterwards. If we specifically look at the improvements within the data, we see that first and second years had dramatic improvements from their pre to post assessment, but not so much for the third years. So this made me wonder if my integrated curriculum was good for younger students, but not so good for older. So I knew that moving forward that I needed to make an experiment looking at the integration process with upper elementary. Every year at my school, upper elementary has some type of big fair that they do, whether it's the science fair, inventors fair, or imaginary island. Now, I did this experiment last year in 2020, and it worked out very nicely because we had these individual pods that made excellent group experiment and control groups. Uh, that year specifically was the science fair, so I want to look at how my PE lessons could increase memorization and critical thinking in terms of the scientific method. To create this experiment, I needed physical education lessons that also taught the scientific method. So we're literally going to perform experiments that are active in PE. So when we look at the 6 weeks or the 6 lessons that we use, we have how powerful are you, which had to do with standing jump height and how much watts a person was producing depending on how much they weighed. We had how exercise affects heart rate, so we had different cohorts doing different exercise and looking at the increases in their heart rate. We had if exercise improved math ability. So we had people doing math facts before, some not exercising, some exercising, and then doing the math fact sheet again and seeing if there was an improvement there. We had does physical activity improve memory? Reaction time, can that be improved? Arm length and throwing speed was an interesting one as well. But we had lots of these legitimate experiment questions that we were going to perform in PE. And as we talked about them, and perform these experiments, we were going step by step through the scientific method so that they were hearing those steps and then applying them as well. Every experiment, there would be a title. Every experiment, we would talk about the question that was being asked. The students would make a hypothesis of what they thought. After I would describe what they would be doing for the experiment, we talked about the control group. We talked about the independent and dependent variable. From there, they would do the experiment, and we would gather the data. From the data, the students would then come up with a conclusion and see how that matched or didn't match their hypothesis. But every single lesson that you see here, we would go step by step through the scientific method, so they were literally applying the scientific method and doing it over and over again, which theoretically should help them with their own science experiments. So again, because this was the COVID year that we were back in school, we had these small pods which made perfect experiment groups. So the first class was my control group. They received lessons that did not integrate with the scientific method. They integrated with another thing that they were doing in culture. They were still legitimate lessons, but they had nothing to do with the scientific method. And again, they served as a control. Class number 2, they only heard concepts from the scientific method in PE, which, because I have a lot of trust from my school, they allowed that, because usually you would not let a co-curricular teach such a major concept, but they know that I've taught the scientific method as a classroom teacher, and they trusted that I could do a good job with these integrated PE lessons. When we look at class 3, they received the integrated PE instruction from me as well as classroom instruction. And then classes 4 and 5, they were given that integrated PE lesson, but from another adult. And then they also got classroom instruction. So the interesting variable there is that, was it just me that was causing the change, or could another adult use the lesson and the concepts of integrating the scientific method with PE and still find success? Before we did any lessons and before anyone gave instruction about the scientific method in the classroom, each classroom did the same pre-test, which had 2 components to it. The first part was basic memorization of what are the steps, what is control, what are the variables. And then page 2, the students would read an experiment, and this is the critical thinking component. They needed to give it a title that applied to what they read. So even if they made something creative, that still had to show that they identified what the experiment is actually looking at. Because the science fair ran pretty long, for 6 weeks, so did my experiment. So each class received 6 lessons over the 6 week period, 1 lesson per week. The control group did Native American sports, which still integrated with their study of Native Americans, but didn't have anything to do with the scientific method per se. While the other classes, the experiment groups, did the integrated physical education lessons with the format of going through the introduction to questions and identifying every other piece of the scientific method. After the 6 weeks, the students were given the post-test. Now, the first part was identical to the pre-test, basically the memorization part. Could they tell me the steps of the scientific method, and then could they also tell me what a control is and what the variables are? On page 2, with the critical thinking component, they were given a new experiment that they needed to read through and then give a title for. And then page 3 was just asking whether they thought that PE helped with their understanding of the scientific method. So again, the reason why I did this experiment was because I wasn't sure whether these integrated PE lessons were going to help older students, but my hypothesis was that at the very minimum, it would help with memorization because they're going to hear the concepts over and over again. But I wasn't sure how much improvement it would do with the critical thinking. But at the very least, though, I expected that memorization would be better in integrated PE lessons of just sheer repetition and volume. While I couldn't necessarily test it, I also thought that if the students had these examples of experiments that they were physically doing, that they were simultaneously the participant as well as the tester, that would help them not only create their own experiment, but initiate it and understand how to collect the data. So even though I didn't necessarily test for it, I thought that it would help them as well with their own science fairs. Another question that this experiment was asking was whether these integrated PE lessons can stand on their own without me. That if these lessons to be effective need me to teach them, then they really aren't effective lessons. Granted, I created them, so I have a better or more nuanced understanding. I know how to improvise or tweak things so that they work in the moment, but the write-ups should still be effective for another person. And if it's not, then it's not the lessons that are effective, it's just me as a teacher. But what I wanted to see was whether these integrated physical education lessons were the cause of improvement over the control group. Another interesting variable, especially with the classrooms that were not taught by me but by another adult, was just how enthusiastic they were to do these lessons. That again, this is your classroom teacher that has to teach physical education. So their enthusiasm or their enjoyment or their understanding of it is going to affect how they communicate these lessons and run these lessons with the students. So that was another variable built into this experiment as well. So taking a look at the data, I apologize that it is a little bit small and hard to see, but the way that I went about it was on the pre-test and post-test, there were the two sections. There was the memorization section, and then there was the critical thinking section. For the memorization section, students could get a total score of 10 if they could correctly list the 6 steps of the scientific method, so that would give you 6 points. If you could explain what a control was, that was 2 points. And then if you could explain what a independent and dependent variable are, that gives you the total of 10 points. For The critical thinking component, you could also get a maximum score of 10 points because each experiment had two variables that uh, should have been included in the title. So that's what I was looking for. They could use a creative title, it could be funny and things like that, but they had to talk about the variables. They had to correctly identify them by reading the experiment, putting those variables into the title, and then also making an interesting title that you'll see in lots of science fairs. Some of those catchy ones that sometimes make you chuckle. So after recording the scores from the pre-test to post-test, I then looked at the change of whether the scores went up, went down, or stayed the same. From there, I also included in the data from the post-test survey whether they believed that the PE lessons they received helped them understand the scientific method better. Finally, I looked at the averages based on grade, and then I took those averages and averaged those out so I could see whether there was an improvement for the actual class itself. But I did want to investigate whether there were any changes specifically happening in certain grade levels, like I saw in that first experiment where it seemed like it was very beneficial for younger ages, but not so much for the older. I wanted to check within this experiment if that was true as well, that if there was only specific grade levels that seemed to be benefiting more than others. Just for my own sense of organization, if there was no change or a positive change, you'll see it highlighted in green. And if there was a negative change, then I highlighted that in red to make it easier to see for myself and hopefully for you to be able to see it a little bit easier as well. So here is that data in graphic form now. We see that we're looking at by class, and then our y-axis is the number of correct answers that they got from the pre-test and post-test. Again, the pre-test was out of 10 points, the post-test was out of 10 points, and we're looking at averages now. So the first thing I want to highlight is that every single group, including the control group, did improve from the pre-test memorization to post-test, as well as the pre-test critical thinking to the post-test. So that's what you would hope to see after 6 weeks of learning about any subject, is that the students are going to learn that content better and then should be able to show in some way that they have greater understanding. So in this scenario, we see that every single group did show improvement. Now, as you look at this graph a little bit harder, you'll start to see that the rates of improvements between the control group to the other groups is definitely different. Every single experiment group did better than the control group. So, looking at that, you could safely say that integration is superior because we're seeing better scores. But then let's look a little bit deeper into comparing these different experiment groups now. This next graph is comparing the experiment groups to each other, specifically looking at their rates of improvement over the control group. So remember I said that every group did do better than the control group, but now let's see by how much. Interestingly enough, every experiment group, for the most part, did about 2 times better in the memorization section than the control group. So, in terms of the integrated PE lessons, it gives a consistent increase of about twofold, at least in this experiment. We definitely see some differences, though, when it comes to the improvement in critical thinking, that the gym-only group and the gym and with the other adult plus the classroom had dramatic improvements of over 8 times more than the control group. The gym class plus the classroom instruction had close to 6 times more. And then we do see one group that had the classroom instruction with the PE instruction from another adult not do as well. And we can get into that more so. But what we can plainly see, though, is that the improvement in critical thinking with 3 out of the 4 groups was dramatic, 6 and 8 times greater than the control group. So, looking at the conclusion, I think it's very clear that integrated physical education lessons with the Montessori classroom are superior than what you might consider a traditional PE lesson that only looks at gross and fine motor skills, um, and maybe sports and rules and things like that. If we include content from the classroom, we see that memorization is increased, and in this experiment, every classroom experienced 2 times better memorization. But then, maybe more importantly, we saw a dramatic increase in the critical thinking components in 3 out of the 4 groups. One group had 6 times, and 2 groups had 8 times better critical thinking. I believe this goes back to the heart of Montessori, that when the children do things, when they physically do things with their hands, whether they are playing the game, whether they are doing the experiment, but when they're actively engaged, they're going to learn better. And we see that not only did they do better with just the memorization side, but I believe that because they were actively participating as well as being the testers themselves, they were literally and legitimately doing experiments every single week. That by the end of this 6 week course, when it was time for the post test and they were doing their own science fairs, that they had a better understanding because they did it themselves 6 times more than the control group. So remember, one of my questions that I had, like one of those sub questions, was whether these lessons can stand on their own, and the answer is yes. And personally, thankfully, that's the case. The class that did the best was class number 5, and that was another adult using my PE lessons, the integrated PE lessons, and then also receiving classroom instruction. So we could see that this group actually outperforms the group, or both groups, that I personally taught, which, like I said, this is a good thing because this means that the lessons themselves are the catalyst for learning. It's not just me. The group that had the second highest improvement, surprisingly, was the class that only had the integrated PE lessons with no classroom instruction. That was not something that I was expecting. Now, I think partially how this is explained, though, is that this class had the worst pre-test scores. Um, and then what happened was, with their integrated PE instruction, their post-test scores resembled the other integrated PE experiment groups, so that, as I state, it caught them up. However, because they started so low, their rate of improvement was dramatic. But this is also interesting data because it shows the effectiveness of the integrated PE lesson by itself without any classroom instruction, that this could legitimately teach the scientific method and how to conduct an experiment. The implications to this are huge because integrated physical education lessons can reinforce concepts that are being learned in the classroom, but they may also be able to effectively teach lessons that we just don't cover or can't cover in the classroom. One of the questions that every teacher has every year is, how do I fit it all in? Well, one of the answers might be that something that you can't cover in the classroom because you just don't have time, maybe some of those concepts could actually be outsourced to your co-curriculars, whether it's physical education or music or art, drama, whatever co-curriculars you have in your school. Imagine having far less stress as a teacher, knowing that something that maybe you wish you could have covered in the classroom curriculum, it will be covered somewhere else, and they'll still get legitimate, good content. But if we're not teaching new things, at the very least, we're reinforcing. I think co-curriculars have an excellent ability to do deep dives into things that we just don't have time for in the classroom. For example, if a classroom is studying a specific time period or culture, investigating the indigenous sports of a culture or looking at a sport from a certain time period, so many times sports give us so much information about fundamental needs that integrating our physical education lessons, um, to me, it's a no-brainer. Considering the last experiment that I did where I saw the younger students doing better than the older students, I wanted to see if the same thing happened in our upper elementary experiment. And interestingly enough, we saw the sixth graders doing pretty well with the memorization, and the fourth and fifth graders doing really well with the critical thinking. So I don't know if this really means anything. Um, we saw improvements overall, but in general, it seems like maybe for the older students, the repetition is what they needed. And for the younger ages, it could possibly be that physically doing the things helped them better understand the concepts. But I may be looking too hard into it. Still, though, I found this data interesting. When we looked at Classroom 4's improvement, this was the one that had the least amount of improvement over the control group compared to the other groups. So this classroom was taught by, so they had classroom instruction, and then their PE instruction, the integrated PE, was taught by another adult. Um, I wanted to point out two things about why their scores might be less, the improvement was less than the other experiment groups. So number one, I do want to point out, and there's nothing I could do about this. It was just how the classrooms were arranged. But classroom number 4 just had uh, not so many students. Their pod was small. Um, so it changes the average. Where if other pods had 13 or 14, you have more data to pull from, and you get a different average from that. With this group, having less students meant that if one student didn't do very well, that would pull the whole average down. Now, the other thing I do want to mention, though, with this group is that the adult who is teaching the integrated PE lessons many times would ask if I wanted to teach it instead, uh, which the reason why this teacher was asking was because they did not want to teach it. They didn't have the same motivation. And I have to figure that if this teacher was not feeling so enthusiastic about teaching or didn't like physical education or thought this was a waste of time or I don't know what the teacher's motivation was. I do know that this teacher appreciated the lessons, but I also know that this teacher didn't really want to do it. So we see that teacher enthusiasm could be another reason why classroom number 4 was lower. Some data that I found incredibly interesting was that 5 students in the control group said that their integrated PE helped them understand the scientific method. They were studying Native American sports. They were not studying the scientific method. So I don't know how they thought it helped them. Maybe it did in some very obscure way, but truthfully, it should not have helped them. That the Native American sports, I never talked about the scientific method. I never talked about experiments or any of those things. So the fact that we had students in the control group saying that it helped them, I found somewhat amusing, actually. Um, every single group, though, it was a mixed reaction in the experiment groups, that some said it did help, some say it didn't help. On average, we see that it helped tremendously, but on an individual basis, that some were saying that it did and some were saying that it did not. Uh, I think this kind of highlights the fact that we don't always know what is best for us, truthfully. Uh, that the students may not know what is actually teaching them, that we may not be aware of the different tricks or strategies or things that help us out the most, and that's actually a very difficult thing to do, is to understand what we need to help us the most. So that's one of our roles as educators, is we need to provide different ways of teaching because we don't know what is going to create that spark in our student. When we look at all the different responses for people who said yes, that the integrated PE lessons helped, the three things that stand out, that repetition was good, that several of the people said that going over things over and over and over again was what was beneficial about these integrated PE lessons. Another word that stood out was the concept of easier, that many students said that these integrated PE lessons made understanding the concepts easier. You could take that in multiple ways. I wonder if they meant easier because instead of reading about something, they were physically doing it. We have so many different learning styles that some people do better by listening or reading or doing. So when someone says that these lessons made it easier for them, I wonder if it was because it just provided different ways for them to understand the same material. Finally, we see um, what I think is probably the most important attribute in these integrated physical education lessons is people brought up the term fun. That anyone, students in particular, do better when they're having fun. If you think about doing anything in your life, it's better if it's fun. So if these lessons are fun, they're going to be in a better mindset to learn. When we're having fun, difficult tasks just feel easier. So if the students are having fun, they are more receptive to learn. And that is, again, like I think that is the biggest advantage that I have in the PE setting, is that I do to the best of my ability, I make these lessons fun. My favorite answer was, I don't know how it helped, I just know it did. Maybe because I got to physically experience it. Uh, to me, this highlights the idea that we don't always know what we need to help us. And this student didn't know how it helped, but the student was able to identify that it did help, having these physically integrated lessons. So, interestingly, that this student is aware enough to know it helped, but just they're not sure how. The statement of physically experiencing it, I think, goes back to the Montessori concepts of using our hands to learn. That one of the best ways to learn is to do. And this student probably figured out that by doing these experiments, you learn how to conduct an experiment. So, this is my life's work. I will continue to create lessons that integrate with the classroom curriculum. Um, I love the physical education setting. I love the classroom setting too, but I get the best of both worlds through this process of integration. I will continue to conduct experiments looking into the efficacy of these integrated physical education lessons, tweaking them, trying to learn what works best, how I can improve them, but there's still plenty for me to investigate. But so far, the research is looking good. So there's more to do. And if you've been listening to this presentation, you are a classroom teacher who needs to do all of your physical education lessons, or you're an administrator for your school, I would implore that you consider this integration process in all of your co-curriculars. Um, we see the benefits of just integrating one co-curricular with physical education, the improvements that it made with these students. So imagine if every single co-curricular in its own way could integrate with what's happening in the classroom curriculum. That you could conduct music experiments. You could look at different experiments with color or different types of mediums. You could, there's so many possibilities of how you can integrate um, the different co-curriculars, not only into the science fair, but just in general into the classroom curriculum. So if you're a classroom teacher and you also have any expertise in any of the co-curriculars that you're being asked to teach, then feel free to integrate them and play to your strengths because the students will get more out of it. And if you're an administrator, I think this is the way to go. Have your co-curriculars align themselves with the classroom curriculum, and you'll see so many benefits for the students. And then also your co-curricular teachers will get the scope and sequence from the classrooms, that they don't have to reinvent the wheel. I will be the first one to admit, though, that it is a lot of work to look at what's happening in the classroom, understand your own content that you're teaching in your specific co-curricular, and then integrate them together. That is not a small task. So I understand what I'm asking is gigantic, but if you have a co-curricular teacher who seems interested or willing to do this, I think it is definitely worth it. Before we wrap up here, I just wanted to highlight one more experiment that I did. This one, uh, far less as intense as the one I just described. But basically, the students were studying the human body, and with one classroom, I wanted to see if I could teach them the pathway of blood through the heart and the lungs through a game. So this was specifically looking at teaching with a integrated physical education lesson, not reinforcing anything, but taking a concept that they don't know and trying to teach it legitimately through a game. So the game that I chose was kickball, and we called it cardiovascular kickball. It was like kickball, but the big difference being that the base path followed the path of blood to the heart. So when you look at that diagram there, that was how I checked to see the understanding of the students, that they need to put those labels in order. And the way that they did that is they needed to remember how they ran through the base path when they were playing the cardiovascular kickball. The game itself, I used color-coded hula hoops. I described the names of the parts of the heart, and what I was hoping was, as they played the game, kicked the ball, ran through the bases, that they got the general idea of the flow of blood through the heart. Again, the students had not received any type of instruction about the heart or blood flow previous to this kickball game. And when they did that post-test where they needed to label the order of how blood goes through the heart and the lungs, about 60% got a perfect score, and another 25% or so only had one mismatch. I find that pretty impressive for a concept that they had never seen before. After one game, 60% were able to now know the flow of blood through the heart. And another 25% only mismatched one. So after one PE game, I think those results are pretty impressive. So if you're interested in these integrated physical education lessons with a Montessori classroom, I invite you to go to my website, montessoriphysicaleducation.com. There, you can dip your toes in with our free resources section, where you can see those arrows that are pointing to that area. There's two different things there. There's the free lesson plans, including this cardio kickball game that I just talked about. That's there, as well as many other free lesson downloads. And then there's another section called at-home lessons, which are write-ups for lessons that I used back in 2020 that are effective for virtual PE learning that still are integrated with the classroom curriculum. I know that a lot of us are now going back virtual because of the Omicron variant. So, um, this year in some ways feels almost more topsy turvy. So, if this is you and you're struggling with what you want or what you can do in your virtual PE setting, please feel free to use these at home lessons. They're tried and true and tested, and um, you know, I think it was the best that I could do uh, teaching physical education virtually while still integrating these lessons with the classroom curriculum. So please feel free to check out the free lessons as well as the virtual lessons if you need them. Here is the social media that I have out there. Um, I'm pretty engaged with Facebook, not so much with Twitter or Instagram just yet. I respond best to email though. Please feel free to email me any of your questions that you may have about this presentation or anything in general about these Montessori physical education lessons that I create. If you made it all the way through, I want to thank you so much for listening to my presentation. Thank you for being interested in physical education as well. That I got my start with physical education because my school just didn't really have a comprehensive curriculum. It was outsourced to a company that would just do dodgeball and basketball, and I knew it could be something so much better. So if you're here at this presentation and you've listened all the way through, um, I respect the fact that you understand that PE is important, um, and I'm so happy that you're considering this integration with the classroom as well, because I believe through this data that it really can make such a difference. Thank you so much for listening to the presentation. I know it was a lot of information. If you take away anything, hopefully you will see the importance and the power of integrating the classroom curriculum into physical education. The data speaks for itself. If you have any more questions for me specifically, the best way to reach me is by email. My email is nicholas_lepine@yahoo.com. If you contact me through any other social media, it's going to be Montessori Physical Education. But like I said, personal email is the best. I'll respond to that the quickest. Thank you again, and have a great rest of the weekend.